Well, hello everyone. I know we have folks joining in from different time zones, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Anuradha Mittal. I'm Executive Director of the Oakland Institute. Thank you very much for joining us today for the webinar, A Reckoning, Holding Perpetrators Accountable in Sri Lanka. I will start by introducing Dr. Nimmi Gowrinathan, an activist, a writer, and a scholar, and the founder of the Politics of Sexual Violence Initiative at the City College of New York, which is a co-sponsor of the webinar today with the Oakland Institute. Dr. Gowrinathan's most recent book is Radicalizing Her, Why Women Choose, examines the complex politics of the female fighter. Dr. Gowrinathan has kindly agreed to facilitate today's webinar, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Nimmi. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you all for being here with us today at what I think is an important moment to have this conversation. I want to first express my gratitude for the partnership of the Oakland Institute and the consistent solidarity of Anuradha herself over the years with the communities in Sri Lanka. We have noticed it, we have felt it, and are deeply, deeply grateful for it. We're going to hear today from people who are deeply embedded in struggles on the island in different ways and from different spaces, from engaged research with aggrieved communities in Sri Lanka, diaspora organizing, supporting asylum cases, and disrupting scholastic and policy dialogues that begin with a deep faith in the state. So we are positioned in different spaces, but all engaged in a different way and have different roles, I think, in this struggle. At the end, we will share some social media accounts of those you should follow for up-to-date reporting and analysis on the island. This, of course, is not a comprehensive list, but some, that might give you ongoing on-the-ground information on what's happening there. So we'll start today with Anuradha, who I think will speak to some of the intensive research that her institute has done and what they've found in regards to some of the structural issues facing Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Nimmi. Hello, everyone, again. Well, I think I'm going to start with the international headlines and video coverage that went viral as tens of thousands of citizens in Sri Lanka stormed the lavish presidential palace of Gotabaya Rajapaksa on July 9th. This came after months of protests by the Sri Lankan citizens over the mismanagement of the country's economy. Massive shortages of food, fuel, and power had halted everyday life. According to the World Food Programme, 86% of the population is currently coping by eating less or skipping meals. Storming of the presidential quarters hopefully marks the end of a family dynasty which amassed massive wealth during its rule of the island nation. It embezzled country's resources, stashed stolen wealth in foreign offshore accounts, impoverished the nation. But internationally, family's legacy is one of a ravaging civil war, which left a trail of torture, abductions, massacre of civilians. A legacy where government critics and Tamil civilians were subject to white van disappearances, and where thousands remain missing, unaccounted for even today. Personally, as I saw the video of protesters, I was once again reminded of this young mother of a 5-year-old who I met in the basement of a church in Mullaitivu in December 2014. Elections were underway. She, along with the others, had to come in the evening as the night fell to escape the attention of the CID. Her words still echo in my head, in my heart. She said to me, "I've been waiting for my husband for the last 5 years. Now that the government says that it has closed file on my husband, I want to speak out for myself. I'm tired of being silenced. I'm no longer scared." She said those words to me when you could touch the fear as the country was headed to elections. CID presence, the military presence, the necessity to get clearance from the government to even travel to the north. That courage has remained with me. So while the world's attention is focused on protests, I keep thinking of every father, mother, wife, and other loved ones who I heard from. When I arrived in Trincomalee, the word somehow got out that I was there to take the testimony for the United Nations, which was not true. The line that started early in the morning snaked around the building. Early morning to late evening, I was scribbling, taking notes. It seemed like there was no end. For all of us, perhaps, who are on this webinar, we know it was under Gotabaya Rajapaksa as the Secretary of the Ministry of Defense and his brother, Mahinda Rajapaksa, that the most horrific war crimes were committed against the Tamil minority, with the Sri Lankan military crushed the decades-long armed struggle in the northern and eastern provinces. The Rajapaksa brothers oversaw the indiscriminate bombing and murdering of thousands of Tamil civilians at the end of the war, in what many observers have called a genocide. In May 2009, nearly 40,000 civilians were killed after they were herded into so-called no-fire zones and then mercilessly bombed. So while the world has been reporting on citizens' protest against economic woes amidst heavy military surveillance and the watchful buzz of drones, in the Mullaivaikkal town for the Remembrance Day this May 14th, few of us perhaps saw rows and rows of Tamil mothers, sisters, fathers, and brothers as they wailed and lit flames to remember their loved ones on the Mullaivaikkal beach in a rite of communal mourning. In Mullaitivu for over 33,000 days, dozens of wives and mothers have protested outside the local administrative offices demanding the return of their loved ones or answers as to where they are. Now, till the economic collapse, Rajapaksas were hailed as national heroes. They ruled with impunity and blood on their hands. Instead of accountability and justice in the aftermath of the conflict, the Rajapaksa regime has hampered international investigations into the war crimes and promoted extremist Sinhalese Buddhist nationalism. The war against the minority population has continued under a different guise. As documented by the Oakland Institute, displacement of thousands of Tamil people from their lands and homes with continued military occupation of the northern and eastern provinces remains a persistent issue. The military occupation of the traditional Tamil land is extreme, with a ratio of 1 soldier for every 6 civilians in the northern province, 1 soldier for every 2 civilians in the Mullaitivu district. Now, despite this economic crisis, over a decade after the end of the war, the military expenditure had ballooned to over $1.57 billion in 2020, higher than at the peak of the war in 2009. Our last year's report, Endless War, revealed that 12 years after the brutal end of the Civil War, the island nation had become an ethnocratic state, intensifying the colonization and Sinhalization of Tamil lands and the persecution of the minority Tamil population. The report exposed how government-led efforts to geographically fragment the North and East are accompanied by a strategy to systematically erase Tamil culture and history. In early 2021, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, warned about worrying trends such as deepening impunity, increasing militarization of governmental functions, ethno-nationalist rhetoric, and intimidation of civil society in Sri Lanka. Recognizing the demonstrated inability and unwillingness of the government to advance accountability at the national level, the Commissioner called for international action to ensure justice for international crimes. Not much seems to have happened following Michelle Bachelet's call. Nor with the fall of the Rajapaksa dynasty and the former president on the run, national and international legal mechanisms must be urgently activated to bring both Rajapaksa brothers and other perpetrators of war crimes and human rights abuses to justice. The victims and their families, as well as the country's hope for justice, for peace, for reconciliation, has waited for too long. Thank you, Nimmi.
Thank you, Anuradha, for sort of setting up the background and the history, and really the confirmation that your research and your institute's research has done of some of these things that I think Tamil activists on the ground have been trying to put forward for a very long time. One of those is with us here today, Anushani Alagarajah, who is a writer, scholar, and activist, and the co-director of Adayaalam think tank. And she's someone I learned from, and I'm grateful to be in community with. And we're so pleased to hear from you today, Anushani.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I will speak about what accountability means to different victims groups targeted by state violence, and how they connect justice and accountability to their everyday lives. The violence many of the groups face are multi-layered, and different victim groups depending on their location and experience, have asked for different kinds of justice and accountability. Even though accountability for the war crimes committed against Tamils have always been the key demand of the Tamil community as a whole, local communities have always articulated accountability as a process and a combination of many things. I break this down with examples with three key issues Tamil communities have been relentlessly advocating for. Families of the enforced disappeared, and their quest for justice is one of the key issues that is talked about a lot locally and internationally. The families of the disappeared are marking 2,000 days of their continuous protest on the 12th of this month. Over 130 members have died since the beginning of the protest without any answers. The families have always advocated for international accountability, but some of their demands have also been quite simple. At the end of the war, when people surrendered to the military, there was a logbook where everybody entered their details before being taken by the military. The protesting families are asking for releasing the list of people who were taken. They're asking for the list of camps where the surrendees were taken to. Some families know which camps their families were taken to, and asking for the details of who were and are at the camps. Unfortunately, in our patriarchal system, many women need to know what happened to their fathers and husbands in order to change land ownership, get approvals at the bank, and to be eligible to receive aid in order to support their daily economic and social lives while they wait for holding their perpetrators accountable. In this context, fulfilling their demands of releasing list of names, or in short, truth, does not only mean a small part of justice, but also accountability from the part of the state, acknowledging that they do have a list, that they took people to their camps, that they are responsible for the disappearances. The second issue that cuts across Tamil homeland is land acquisition. 5 years ago, in a community meeting with women who are fighting to get their land back, we asked a question: what do they want as reparation, or if they would like compensation for the land they have lost? A woman stood up and said that she does not need reparation for a land that is not lost, but occupied by the military. She said, I do not even want to talk about reparation, while the military could just remove their camp and get out of there so I can go back to my land. She also said that maybe what the military could do is give her back all the trees they have cut down, or plant new trees, because she used to sell fruits and honey and also get firewood from the trees. Tamil community is very close to their land. Land is never just a land. It is ancestry, it is culture, it is sense of homeland it provides, it is the economic stability and livelihood it provides, and much more. Tamil community relies on agriculture and fishing for their livelihood. Taking the land away from them and occupying farmlands and coastal areas means economic violence. It means cultural violence. Depriving people of their income should be considered state violence too. In a community that has over 70,000 female-headed households, taking the land away from women is damaging for decades to come. Not only many of the lands are still being occupied by the state and the military, more lands are actively being taken over or going through a singular Buddhization process. Sri Lanka might be the only country that has a task force to acquire lands under the pretense of archaeology and supported by the state institutions such as Forest Department and Wildlife Department and military. This is a small part of the bigger agenda of taking over the border villages that connects the northern and eastern provinces that would make up what we think of as Tamil homeland. There are studies and reports, as Anuradha mentioned, available if you want to know more. It would be a matter of days to release these lands if the state decided to do so. It would be the sort of trust building or goodwill activity any government could do. This would not need an international or a new domestic mechanism. This can be easily done through the existing state institutions. But again, not only no such activity has happened, but more lands are being taken as the country currently goes through a crisis. This connects to my third and the most important point, militarization of the Tamil homeland. As the south of the country is now seeing glimpses of what is it like to live with military presence, victim and survivor communities here have been living under military occupation for decades, especially since the end of the war. If you talk to people here, they would never refer to Sri Lankan military as ours. The military is always the other. In one of the meetings with women from all ethnic groups, a woman from Deep South said that she does not understand why Tamil community has a problem with military staying in their camps in the north and east, because they also have military camps in the south too. To that, a Tamil woman calmly replied that living with military on your own land is like living with murderers. The military killed many of our families, raped many men and women, disappeared them, took our livelihoods, continued to suppress our right to remember, freedom of assembly, and violate many other fundamental rights. She asked, would you want to live with someone who killed your family members and destroyed your life as you know it? She spoke for many Tamil people who want the military to be removed from their homes. Accountability on a broader political context is bringing individual perpetrators or military personnel who are credibly accused of committing grave crimes to justice. And justice for a lot of people also look like removing military camps and military-run businesses, removing military memorials, whereas Tamil community is criminalized for remembering their dead. Accountability also look like cutting down military budget that is bigger than education and health combined. Military not getting involved in civilian activities, military being held accountable for cracking down on human rights defenders and activists all the time. We believe one of the main reasons Sri Lanka is where it is now is because the state's military spending and its decision to end war at any cost, even at the cost of a potential economic crisis. The economic crisis cannot be understood outside of the long-standing human rights crisis. It is only an extension of the government's discriminatory policies and practices. Past governments, UN resolutions, and other mechanisms in the past failed to ensure even the simplest expectations of accountability are met. What connects all of the issues I've mentioned so far is the lack of political will. There need not be a local mechanism or an internationally approved mandate to get things done. Some of the procedures could have easily been done through the systems that already exist, but there is no political will from the very start for anything to take course. Even in the context of current protest movement in the South, a lot of the conversations are centered around the economic accountability and corruption. The demands of the Adayaalam did not go far enough to get even closer to the accountability demands of the victim communities, or the way they understand accountability as a part of a system that is historically corrupt, violent, and oppressive. Those who have committed grave crimes are holding the office now and continue to commit more crimes as the world watches. If we don't learn from the mistakes we made in the past, and if we do not take necessary steps to ensure non-recurrence, we will be back at this point again. We will be facing the same crisis again. The real reckoning has to happen from the very bottom to the top, addressing the hard questions, addressing the Tamil question, addressing a political solution. Without that, no changes will ever be sustainable. And lastly, without political will, none of the institutions and procedures the state set up will be ineffective or provide justice or accountability to the victim communities. Tamil victim groups are always the first to call out that the local mechanisms are not independent and lack political will. After giving time, as they were always asked by the external and southern actors, victim groups have completely lost trust in the state and any domestic procedures or mechanisms. As the community now look for the support of international community to hold the perpetrators accountable and push for truth and justice, the conversation also has to expand towards how do we make sure victim groups get interim justice parallelly to manage their day-to-day life in the middle of the crisis as they continue to push for a broader political accountability. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Anushani. I'm sure there'll be questions for you on that. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A and I will compile them towards the end. I'm going to speak today about something that Anushani is speaking to and I think fighting against, which is the lens through which we view this moment, where this lens is positioned, and the power that it has to shape a particular narrative. So in the West, Sri Lanka has suddenly been given space in places like the front page of the New York Times, a kind of alms offered in exchange for the voyeurism drawn to the spectacle of collapse. A New York Times reporter, Emily Shaw from the presidential palace, described the scene It was an atmosphere of joy and disbelief, with a bit of absurdity and a bit of comedy thrown in. A very Sri Lankan sort of revolution, relatively low-key and polite. So from the global north, the lens can clearly be adjusted anywhere on the spectrum from liberal to overtly colonial in its gaze. The spectacle that draws it can itself be a powerful tool. If it's used inside the sanction, which should be read nonviolent, parameters of liberal acceptance of a spectacle, it can draw attention to dissent, but will inevitably be barricaded by a repressive regime with no incentive to take substantive action. When used by the state, as Adayaalam notes in Kashmir, the spectacle of disappearances is a display of force to deter further dissent. Protest of the mothers of the disappeared, she then classifies as intentionally performative, towards creating a counter-spectacle, which is the only option available inside these sanctioned parameters of resistance for oppressed peoples. So in Sri Lanka today, the people have already started receiving fuel, while renewed abductions and arrests of protesting civilians reinforce the power of a militarized state. As Anushani notes as she's bringing forward, there is a different familiarity and intimate knowledge of the state and its capacity for violence, dependent on one's identity. My colleague Nick Smith notes in his work on South Africa, communities like the Tamil and Muslim communities in Sri Lanka have always been constantly vigilant to the ways in which seeming concessions by the state are in fact a means of disarming a grievance, of stripping it of its political nature. This, what you feel in Anushani's remarks and I sense in others at this moment, is the deep frustration that dampens empathy. No? If these communities, if our communities have known the nature of the state for decades, if it has been shown in the loss of hundreds of thousands of our family members' lives, why did it take this moment to be seen? It's a question I think we already know the answer to. So this sort of spectacle seen through the Western lens, right? A narrative is quickly spun around the recent events, capturing the perceptions of the spectacle of protests. The protests were nonviolent, which is not true. A show of people's power, which in some ways was true. It's a peaceful transition between regimes, right? A moment that was read as appropriately disruptive, that is in fact a reaffirmation of structures and a status quo that has been deeply felt by Tamils and Muslims on the island since independence. I've thought back often these days to 2009 and the final stages of war, at a moment where I suppose I came face to face with Gotabaya Rajapaksa in some way. But when thousands of civilians were being massacred every day, I did an interview for an early incarnation of Vice News. And so from my tiny Midtown office as an aid worker and an advocate, I was showing videos of the hospitals being bombed sent to me from Tamil nurses the day before, clips of civilians herded into safe zones, and satellite imagery of those same zones being targeted. The interview was then spliced into an interview with former President, then Defense Minister Gotabaya Rajapaksa, answering pointed questions. So set against these visuals of evidence were his words. We have never knowingly endangered civilian lives. We have never bombed the safe zone. The next year, at a UN session with Yasmin Suka, I presented a dossier of evidence, gender-based violence committed en masse by the Sri Lankan military. Sitting across from me then and still Sri Lankan Army Defense General Shavendra Silva responded, "We are a disciplined force. Disciplined militaries do not do such things." Right? There was no expectation on my end of a reckoning or even accountability. But there was a surprise in both the brazenness of the lie, 0 civilian deaths, that revealed how securely they both sat inside a system of embedded impunity. One that I don't know, in reference to Anuradha's comment, I don't know that it could be deepened. No, this kind of embedded impunity neither even bothered to squirm in discomfort, right? So where the West has proselytized these liberal ideals of justice and human rights to entrench a form of governance, democracy, regimes like those ruling in Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and elsewhere have learned that maintaining a democratic facade will protect supremacist agendas that rely on violent oppression, right? Even though there was this widespread curiosity that made the former president's plane one of the most tracked in recent times, where was he going to land? He and those before him have already been offered safe passage. They have always been protected by the narrative scaffolding of a liberal project anchored in the structures of colonialism. The Western lens has also narrowed in on the economic fragility of Sri Lanka, right? An often real but very useful archetype in the global South that carefully detaches the economy from the political repression that determines its failure. In a recent paper, Drs. Xavier, Bhatia, and Smith traced the safe space around the Sri Lankan state, created by market forces and conflict, offering the government what they term indebted impunity, right, where proximity to whiteness pays dividends in protection from prosecution. Right? This, again, serves the liberal project of reconciliation, a kind of peace defined once by the US ambassador in a conversation with her as inclusive prosperity. This is what peace means from the West, no? This is not a failure of imagination. It is a well-worn, projected pathway to justice through economic empowerment that is calculated, that is safe, that is apolitical. Right? The West is both financially and ideologically committed to the image of Sri Lanka it seeks to project, one that amplifies the spectacle of some revolutions above the realities of human suffering. The lens is also very careful never to hit a reflective surface that might cast a long shadow of accountability, right, on the actions and inactions of the United States government, of the Indian government, of the UN itself in the final stages of the war. Right? Tamils have been asked to choose between truth and justice before and have wound up with neither. So impunity is not tied to a governmental role or a geographic location. It is given, bestowed upon successive regimes who sustain the spectacle of democracy, performing in the presence of whiteness while disappearing dissent. Historic though this moment was in its spontaneity, fervor, and breadth of mobilization, it did not disrupt the structural violence of the state, nor the liberal imaginary that sustains it. So in his search for truth, Tamil women have asked, is my husband dead or alive? From a place of power, the regime chooses not to answer. Justice requires asking a different question, one that forms the basis of a political counter-narrative. If he is dead, who killed him? From a place of embedded impunity, the regime will never have to answer. And I'll pass it on to my colleague and friend, Dr. Kate Vroman, to explain to you why the regime will never have to answer. But I just want to introduce her properly. Dr. Furman is an associate professor of human rights in the Department of Political Science at the University College of London. She has a PhD and JD from Columbia University and practices as a human rights lawyer in Cambodia and The Hague. Her book, which everyone should get, is called Hypocrisy and Human Rights, Resisting Accountability for Mass Atrocities. And I'm very proud to call her a co-conspirator, a friend, and a colleague.
Thank you, Nimmi. So I thought that it might be helpful to talk a little bit today about practically what it means to pursue justice for the perpetrators of mass atrocities, because I think this has become this kind of catchphrase when we talk about Sri Lanka, that we need to pursue accountability and that there is not necessarily an interrogation of what that means. And I think Anushani spoke so movingly about the desires of the victim survivor community and the complexity of their demands. And so I think it's worth kind of restoring a bit of content to those terms. So from a very kind of practical lawyerly perspective, when we talk about the pursuit of justice, we're usually talking about the assignment of individual responsibility to specific perpetrators. And that doesn't definitively imply criminal liability, prison sentences, et cetera, but usually that is what we're talking about: prosecution and conviction in a court of law. And there's really only 4 possibilities for what that can mean. It can mean prosecution in the home country's courts, so the courts of the country where the crimes occurred. It can mean prosecution in a hybrid court, which is done cooperatively between the domestic justice system and international actors. It can mean prosecution in an international court like the ICC, or it can mean prosecution in a foreign country's courts. And each of these options involves slightly different processes and presents slightly different hurdles when we think about the politics of the situation. So if we are looking to pursue justice for perpetrators of atrocities in the country where the crimes occurred, that requires, amongst other things, this is not an exhaustive list, that perpetrators don't have the ability to conceal and destroy the evidence of their crimes. It requires that victims and witnesses are not scared to come forward and testify. It requires that a prosecutor feels safe charging individual high-level perpetrators. It requires that there's enough judicial independence to convict. It requires that it is safe to incarcerate these people, right? That if they are put in prison, they will stay there. And it requires that the political leadership won't immediately pardon them. So, when we listen to what we've just heard about Sri Lanka and the structures of impunity operating there, we can kind of immediately see why this is not necessarily a plausible ask. Likewise, if we're thinking about a hybrid court, again, this is an arrangement where prosecutions occur domestically, located in the home country's courts with a degree of international assistance. And that solves some resource and expertise problems that we often have in the aftermath of atrocities, but it still requires most of that list of things I just said to be true. So again, you need that perpetrators not have power to destroy evidence, intimidate people, and you need buy-in from the political leadership of the country and their voting constituency. When we turn to the international courts, many of these things are no longer true. So usually we're talking about the International Criminal Court nowadays, but we could also be talking about an ad hoc tribunal set up to deal with a specific context. I'm not going to say too much about this here because action at an international court requires either the consent of the state where the crimes occurred or pretty aggressive action by the UN Security Council. So there's kind of an international political obstacle, but I'm happy to kind of discuss those options further in the Q&A if people are interested. So the last option here is prosecution in foreign courts. And that requires that a foreign country, a place that is not where the crimes occurred, have a statute on their books, so a law that confers universal jurisdiction for atrocity crimes, and that the perpetrator in question be on their territory and no longer protected by any immunity from prosecution. So it's worth emphasizing that any justice for mass atrocities is very rare due to the specific political obstacles to each of these avenues. But that last one, option 4, prosecution in foreign courts, is probably the least complex one. However, it is also the avenue to justice that can feel least transformative and least impactful for victim survivors. And that's because, so many activists, scholars, practitioners of transitional justice have observed decisions about what to do about the past are also referendums about present day and future distributions of power. So when justice for atrocities happens outside of the country where the crimes occurred without its government's active participation, it lacks that connection to potential political transformation. And that's really crucial when we are looking at this current political moment in Sri Lanka. Because as prior speakers have mentioned, for many members of the island's Tamil community, this moment of potential political change doesn't feel particularly momentous or indeed necessarily relevant to their lives. For them, real change would require an honest reckoning with the crimes of the past by the Sri Lankan state and by the majority community. So seeing perpetrators convicted in foreign or international courts, I think, for many would bring a sense of relief, a sense of some justice being done, but it wouldn't change the relationship to the Sri Lankan state. And so it probably wouldn't feel like accountability. And Anushani has given us a list of, how it is that different members of the victim survivor community conceptualize accountability. And I think it's pretty clear from that list that those are things that only can happen within the context of domestic processes, right? So, survivors very much want to see justice happen. Many of them are very interested in seeing perpetrators tried and convicted wherever that may happen, but that is not going to be sufficient to feel like accountability for what has happened. And, survivors rightly understand that domestic action is not very likely. So, as Nimmi has just said, I wrote a book on the politics of resisting accountability for mass atrocities. And in looking at what happened after about 90 atrocities over the last 50 or 60 years, what I find is probably not surprising to anyone. Accountability for atrocities is rare. It is deeply beholden to domestic politics. And even really robust international pressure doesn't produce justice. And instead it tends to prompt governments to set up sham institutions, which of course we've seen Sri Lanka do time and time again. And, even allowing for a change of regime, a change to who holds the reins of power, as, I forget which of our speakers, possibly more than one, have already said, Sri Lanka is an ethnocracy, right? So the characteristics of an ethnocracy are first, that membership in the dominant ethnic group and not citizenship in the country determine access to resources and power. And second, that the dominant ethnic group controls the state apparatus and so is able to shape the political system and the country's laws to entrench their position. And what this means is that, the state security force's primary function is often, in fact, the protection of the majority ethnic group's control, not peace, territorial integrity, or even the country's strategic interests. And the upshot of that is a real reluctance to pursue accountability in the abstract, and in practice, the concrete obstacles to the requirements for domestic prosecutions that I mentioned earlier, right? So we have our perpetrators with the ability to control evidence, to control witnesses, to control the court system. And we've seen this, right? We've seen successive governments working to construct and entrench impunity. So this is not a regime problem. This is a state problem. So obviously, this is a fairly pessimistic view. And so I have spent a lot of time over the last few years thinking through what the implications of my research and my findings are for victim survivor communities, especially those who are engaging with international audiences and advocating for accountability. And my work echoes a larger vein of research, which finds that real change in favor of human rights is always a product of these primarily domestic processes. So it is the work of courageous domestic activists. It's a process of internalization of human rights obligations. And these things often depend on democratization or other significant political change. But I think one of the most important things I learned in the research is that none of this is news to victim survivor communities. And this has come through so clearly in my conversations with families of the disappeared in northeastern Sri Lanka and other members of the community, because they know in their bones that this state, no matter who is at the helm, will not provide them with real accountability. So I think the task for international audiences that are engaged on this issue becomes how to take on board that insight, right? And the long list of insights that Anushani gave us today, and how to think about a long game that is aimed at shifting, so changing those deep domestic political constraints, while understanding that in the short term, justice is not going to come from the government of Sri Lanka. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer questions about kind of any of the specifics of institutional design and function.
Thank you so much, Kate. We do have some questions that I am going to tamper with slightly. But I think some really important questions. There's one that I would ask of Anushani. I think you're best situated to answer, and the other I would ask maybe Kate and Anuradha to answer. And I'll just ask them together, and Anushani, maybe you can go first. The first question is about the Office of Missing Persons. The question is what the status is of the Office of Missing Persons. I am going to deepen the question a little bit and ask you to speak about the kind of, I don't know what one would call it, mechanism fatigue that the Tamil people feel. That the women you've spoken to, the commissions and the lessons learned and the Truth Commission and the missing persons and the number of times that these women tell their story, and what that in itself produces and how that changes their relationship and their belief and faith in some of these systems. So if you can answer both what the status is right now and also, you know, what that's like and what that constant sort of telling of a story is doing to particularly women in the Tamil community.
That's such a loaded question. I think the status of the OMP, I could be wrong with all the changes that's happening too fast. There is a commission, there are new commissioners. But I think the latest development was several weeks ago, a commissioner have stepped down from the commission, basically saying the OMP is not independent, which is something the families of the disappeared have said just months after the office was established. It took the commission and the whole civil society years to kind of acknowledge the fact that, yes, it is not independent. Like I said in my piece, the Tamil communities have always been the first to call out when a mechanism is not independent and when they clearly know that it is not going to do anything for them. The government, the current government, the past government, they have always used the OMP as a success measure in their international presentations. You look at EU, New York, UN, wherever they go, they always use OMP as a success mechanism, which doesn't even have the trust of the enforced disappearance community. Not to dismiss the families that wanted to engage with the OMP. There are some families who wanted to engage with the OMP. Again, it is more of a necessity for them to engage, either to get a certificate of absence or certificate of death. Like I explained, these are needed for women in this country to move ahead with changing ownership of land, which then again directly connected to the economy. Whereas the protesting movement has continuously dismissed OMP, and they even wanted the name to be changed. They wanted the word enforced to be added. Nobody just vanishes, right? So from the very start, there has been no consultation with the victim communities in the North and East. There were one or two, but it was not continuous. And we truly believe that OMP was a box-ticking activity. If you look at the timeline of when it was established or when the bill was passed, it was always before a UN session or a Human Rights Council session, right? So that itself should tell you that whether these institutions have the benefit of the victims at the heart, or whether it's just like a looking good activity for the international community. So with the status, and there's absolutely no trust. There was a time people have negotiated with the families of the disappeared, asking them to submit few numbers of cases just to test whether, to test their credibility. And the protesting families have submitted 5 cases to see if the OMP can actually stay within their mandate and do anything. As we all know, that absolutely nothing has happened, and that was it. So people have always been giving them the chance, like like you asked. We were just discussing today about the protests the families are organizing to mark the 2000 days, and we were just asking, how many commissions have you spoken to? And I think they named about 10 to 12 commissions. They were not sure how many commissions they've spoken to. I can only imagine what that kind of experience would do it to someone, to narrate the experience over and over and over again after all these years, but to see nothing, not even an acknowledgement, to see nothing but having to do it again. And also in a community that doesn't really talk about victim protection or mental health, or how that re-sharing narratives can be traumatizing. I don't think there, at this point, anything can be done to restore that faith. It's not like the government has ever done any trust-building activities anyway. I don't think people can go through any more commissions or sit through any more truth-finding or fact-finding mechanism at this point, particularly when the country is going through a deep economic crisis and people are struggling to eat and just get by every day.
Thank you. And I think that sort of even the timing of the OMP gives us a clear insight into the regime's ability to manipulate the kind of requirements of a liberal international community. a second question that I'll ask Anuradha to answer first, and then Kate, is, is a little bit out there, but if this moment of a focus on accountability, insofar as there is a focus on accountability, the question is there an opportunity to have a referendum in the international community on the Tamil desire for self-determination?
I think that's a really good question. This is the time, I think from what we have heard from everyone on the panel and the long history of how does that accountability happen? And we've talked about the dominant ethnic group and the minority ethnic group, which is in terms of power and the impunity, which you so strongly spoke to. That becomes very important, but we have to also look at the international actors. You're looking, for instance, at the neighbor India. Are other countries going to support that? Because you're looking at, again, an occupying power, which is sitting in Kashmir. So I think those are the challenges and the hypocrisy of the international community that we have to also acknowledge. So on one hand, there's impunity within the country and the failure of all national mechanisms, the trust from continued war that the Tamil and the Muslim communities face in Sri Lanka. And then you have this international hypocrisy of democracy and what accountability looks like that you spoke to, Nimmi. That raises the specter of how do we really create mechanisms where victims of mass atrocities anywhere in the world can actually have justice? And when you look across, you don't see any examples where genuine accountability, genuine any kind of reconciliation or justice has been offered to victims of mass atrocities. And I think that is rooted in the failure of democracy and the whole Western liberal agenda of how that is defined, and the lack of political will to actually implement justice mechanisms, because almost everyone is hiding something in their cupboard of human rights violations. Great example of that is India, my own country, right next to Sri Lanka.
Thank you. I would add to that, and I think I'll couple a few questions for Kate after this, that particularly in the Tamil community, there is, I think, oftentimes, it's a misunderstanding, but an inability to grapple with how state-centric the international systems are. And I think that sometimes that gets conflated. In a recent conversation, one of the Tamil politicians from Sri Lanka asked me, the journalist Isapriya, who was killed by the state, why can't she become like Malala for the international community? No, why can't she become a symbol? The first and easiest answer is that one was killed by a non-state actor and the other was killed by the state, right, at that time. And the international community will not go after a state for killing a journalist, and particularly not in a country it has no interest in, right? Second, of course, is the question of whether or not the branding of Malala has actually shifted the position of women's lives in that country, but that is a different issue. So I think that when the notion of self-determination arises, it has to be set against this kind of vantage point and commitment of the international community to state-centric solutions, right? And it's a different moment now than it was in the 1980s. Kate, your thoughts on the referendum on self-determination, but also another question, do you think for the Tamils at this stage, it's worth even engaging in the language of human rights and accountability? Or should they kind of disconnect from these systems altogether? Is there a value to them in continuing to try and push inside these systems that you've laid out as being clearly flawed, if not completely failed?
Yeah, thank you. On the first point, co-sign to everything you've said about the international arena as a system of states, and one which privileges states and their interest above peoples and their interests, or individuals and their interests. But I think the other thing going on here is, something that I've long felt was one of the overlooked tragedies of impunity, which is that the more time passes, the shorter the list of potential responses becomes. So when we are in the midst of conflict and we are kind of seeing mass atrocities unfold before our eyes. Caveated that international action is still rare and inadequate, but the set of things that international audiences and powerful actors within the international system are willing to consider is longer. It includes more creative options. Unfortunately, here we are sitting in 2022, 13 years after the war's end, and it is now, very hard to make the sell to international actors that system challenging responses are necessitated by the acute suffering of the population, right? And what we see, as more and more time passes, is that eventually even justice and the imposition of criminal liability starts to feel distant and impractical. And ultimately, what we find is that simple acknowledgement is now the extent of what is available for accountability. So I think, unfortunately, to me, that suggests that it's fairly unlikely to be able to drum up international support for a referendum of that nature. Nimmi, would you repeat the second question for me, please?
I think you answered part of it, but essentially, given the sort of failures of the language of human rights and accountability, is it worth, particularly I would ask myself, for a newer generation of advocates and activists engaging in this in the way that earlier generations have?
Yeah, I think, this is an important question. It's one that I suspect every activist has to answer for themselves. I'm speaking as a former human rights lawyer, somebody who trains young activists and advocates in a human rights graduate program at a Global North institution. I ask myself this every day, whether a decolonial approach to human rights is even possible, whether the project has any liberatory potential for anyone. And every day I come down very, very, very narrowly on the side of sticking with it. But that's my calculus, right? And I think, for me, to answer this question or to kind of advise anyone engaged in the pursuit of accountability, I think my initial reaction is to say, justice for atrocities is unnatural, right? It is not the natural order. It is not the natural condition. It requires incredible efforts, often by the people who should least have to put in the work in order to create the conditions for justice. But, victim survivor communities have managed it, right? And they have managed it by using the language of human rights, by using the framework, flawed though it is. So I think, for me, it suggests that there is still something to be gained by engaging with it, but that is not a strong or aggressive recommendation that I would make to anyone kind of feeling the pain of years of abandonment and mistreatment by the international community.
If anyone has any last questions, please do put them in the chat. I would maybe just ask the panelists to end on this idea of what Kate, has so accurately called liberatory potential. I think that's what we're all looking for, right? Is the action or the way forward that has liberatory potential. And there, at least for myself, I can say, I have a lot of faith in our people, in other oppressed peoples, because there has always been a kind of innovation around revolution, right, that emerges. And I hope, through my comments and the comments of others, it's only to make clear that one need not stay in the parameters the West has handed you, and should not, whether you choose to engage or not, whether you choose to dismantle or you choose to work within it. It is being conscious of that kind of extortion of political energy towards a false momentum that leads nowhere, right? And to just be conscious of what is behind this sort of liberal agenda as you engage. but to keep finding, even if they are tiny pathways of liberatory potential, which I think the Tamils have and will always continue to do. Anushani, thoughts on that?
No, I have nothing much to ask. I think, like you said, I think after 13 years, we are still protesting. We are still asking for the same things. But I think Kate also mentioned this, but I'm also always aware of the expectations of civil society, the international community, for us to keep doing the work. Resiliency should never be the benchmark. It should never be measured by how much of the hit we can take. I think as the communities show resistance and resiliency and continue to go through this, there should always be enough support and protection for the communities for them to be able to continue this. I think we are also very aware that this is going to be a long process. And I think the one thing that I keep hearing from senior activists that I might not get to see the justice or the change that I want to see in my lifetime. So I think we're also aware many of us are not going to be able to see it, but there needs to be the support, resources, for the lack of a better word, and the sense of community that needs to be continuously provided for the victim communities, solidarity. And it's not just a one-off solidarity, but continuous solidarity for them to continue to push for accountability as they also struggle through their daily life.
Thank you. Anuradha?
Just to say deep gratitude to each one of you. This was incredibly powerful. And I think, Anushani, you've said it very clearly that while I know in my limited experience being with the communities and witnessing the trauma and pain and not knowing when it ends, and yet the resistance, the courageous resistance, which perhaps, which is fueled by, because it is so personal, looking for the loved ones, the disappearances of family members, and the continued oppression, the continued occupation of land. So for us at the Institute, I think our commitment has been, since the first report of The Long Shadow of War, has been really about being accountable to the communities and to be able to do all that is needed in terms of support and elevating the voices of the people on the ground. So, and that commitment remains.
Thank you. Anuradha, Kate? No violence. Well, thank you all for being here. I think this has been recorded and can be shared with the participants' consent. And there's links to both folks who are continually reporting or following what's happening on the ground, along with in-depth research. And please do reach out to any of us if we can support or you have further questions. Thank you so much.